welcome back to another early adopter edition. And in this episode, we're going to be doing my first constraint. So in this channel, we have talked about stereotypes. We've talked about tag values. And today we're going to talk about constraints. These are the three ways of extending your class elements in UML. So let's look at some constraint examples. In this particular case, we have a stereotype to a class element, and we have constraints. And you've learned that a stereotype is, what kind of thing is this? And you have learned that tag values is, what additional information do I need? Where constraints are, what rules must this follow? And so when we're looking at constraints, some examples, let's just drill down into this particular element. And in properties, we're going to go to constraints. So when you're looking at building a constraint, you have type over here on the right, and you have invariant, you have post condition, you have precondition, process, and OCL, or object constraint language, to choose from. So let me move this over here. So when we're looking at each type of constraint, this first one is valid and login is true. So an invariant is to enforce the state rule that must always be true. Let's look at the next one, post condition. In this particular case, this is to validate the expected results after the operation is complete. In this case, authorization, or are they authorized, or is authorized. When we look at the next one, precondition, it is simply the opposite of postcondition. It's to ensure that valid conditions are before the operation starts. So precondition. And then the next one is process, and process is pretty straightforward. And this is what I really refer to as rules. And this is to model workflows or behavior, the sequence of steps that should be followed. And in this particular case, payments before shipment. And then the last one is OCL. And this is an example of OCL language right here. And that's basically to formalize the rules and constraints in UML models. And this is valid age. So the valid age is greater than or equal to 0 and less than or equal to 120. So we're using all three to understand what kind of thing this is, what kind of thing this is. We have the ability to apply shape scripts, and shape scripts give you the ability to customize how the element should look. And if we want to go to another view, we can enable info view. And info view in this particular case is exposing the stereotype, which is boundary, as well as if we go down inside of this particular element here, we can see that the tag value is for graph data unvisited. And we could add constraints here as well. So when we go back over here, we're able to add constraints on almost any element in Sparx, whether it's a class element, which these two are, it's a use case element, a state machine element, or otherwise. You can add constraints to extend the meaning and the intelligence of the element as you're modeling. So in this use case for billing, we're basically telling our story that to access billing, we need to go through an interface for access management. We need to follow some or all of these constraints as we are flowing to billing. You can add constraints on any connector. In this particular case, we have a precondition that access equals valid. And it's a precondition in this case, not an invariant. And that's the story that we're telling. As the credentials are then passed to the billing system, it will validate is active. In other words, is this an active user? Is it a valid user? and it can provide other intelligence such as endpoint URIs and interface types and things like that, so that both parties understand the relationship between them that may or may not be constrained. The most important thing is to understand what kind of thing this is. What is it, a use case? Is it an interface? Is it, in this case, a web page or an ASP page or JSP page, etc.? And you can apply shape scripts to understand the stereotype. And then what's important is to understand the attributes. There are no operations being exposed here, but the attributes and the operations from an object-oriented design perspective, and then the constraints. What kind of things that we need to be following as far as constraints and rules necessary for these two elements to have a relationship and work according to design. It's very interesting when we get to state machines. We've got a class element for startup. We have some attributes and an operation in here. And when we look at the state machine itself, we look at transition from startup to making a decision on service configuration versus pipeline configuration. When we look at this association and we look at constraints, the way that constraints are painted in here is as triggers. So read configuration, and then each one of these connectors here can have constraints that help drive the overall simulation of a particular work effort. So in this case, it's working through the simulation for the state machine. We're just going to go right to service configuration, pipeline configuration, hit OK. It's going to go through use development or application running. Let's just go to this one right here. It dives down based on the constraints of the association leading to a particular end or means prior to closing. So there you go. That's constraints. Hopefully it's not your last constraint in this episode on my first constraint. Please let me know if you've got any questions, concerns down below in comments. Let me know what challenges that you're having with UML in general, from stereotypes to tag values to constraints. As we're building out our own technologies and our design examples as we're moving through, I'm going to be referring to these extensions more often. And until that next episode, happy modeling.